Today we're going to talk about Die Hard, written by Shane Black, produced by Joe Silva, starring Bruce Willis.
No, Nick. Die Hard was the original title that was taken by Joel Silver.
Wait a minute.
Yeah. No, next one. Next one. That's the one right there, yep.
The Last
Boy Scout.
What the hell kind of title is that?
I don't know, it must be something about fishing.
Okay. All right, so let's talk about it. All right, I'm Nick from the St. Paul Filmcast.
I'm Kyle Goethe from GoFilmReviews.com. Welcome to Kyle and Nick on Film, and this is our last episode of 1991.
So, of course, it's going to have the last in the title.
Yep.
With the success of Lethal Weapon and Shane Black writing that, Joe Silver said, what do you got next for me? And he handed him a script called Die Hard. He goes, God, that's such a good title. I'm going to use it for my next film called Nothing Lasts Forever, which is another bad title, but Die Hard worked. And eventually, this movie gets made. Shane Black writing it, and directed by Tony Scott, who's the brother of Ridley Scott.
Yes, and Tony Scott had just come off of Top Gun.
Top Gun.
So like a big ride off of there.
Yeah.
Doing pretty well. You might know this about me. I don't know if all our reviewers do. I'm a self-appointed like Shane Black stan in all the possible ways. I think he's a tremendous writing talent. I think he's a pretty solid directing talent as well.
Don't send him out in the jungle with a bunch of macho
he
men.
doesn't do so well with actual combat, but he
like
can
Predator,
knock it out of the park. I mean, my favorite movie from 2016 was The Nice Guys. I'm also, I think Lethal Weapon 2 is the greatest action film ever made. So I'm a huge fan of Shane Black. This is a movie for me that I've only seen once before watching it for this episode.
Okay.
And watching it the second time, while I admired it a little bit more, I still understand why I don't revisit it in the same way. And it's because personally, I feel like The Last Boy Scout is a bit of a mess. It's a messy movie in a lot of ways. If you don't know the plot about the film, it's a disgraced former Secret Service agent and a disgraced former football player that get together to solve a murder that leads to corruption and conspiracy and all sorts of crazy things happening in the world of NFL.
So it's a lot of what we saw in the 80s of a black guy and a white guy cop team up, like another 48 Hours, Lethal Weapon. This formula just misses the angle, right? I know what they're going for, but it just kind of veers off.
Yeah, and so Shane Black, of course, wrote the screenplay. This was his first writing work in 2 years. He kind of quit writing for a while because of a breakup. His first love had ended a relationship with him, and you can feel that in the writing of this film. It's much more pessimistic. It's much more
angry,
mean-spirited, angry kind of a film. I don't think that's the bane of what it is, but when he handed it over, Tony Scott was really impressed with it, went on to direct, and then while the film was being made, Joel Silver jumps in, Bruce Willis jumps in, and they both kind of wrestled the film away from these guys and forced rewrites, forced changes over like penalty of firing. And that was kind of the underground story of what's going on. Both Scott and Shane Black said they really loved the actual screenplay that it was, but about the second half of this film is completely different.
Which happens is a lot of you got big egos. Damon Wayans had a hit TV show with his brother in Living Color. You got Bruce Willis, who just came off Die Hard Part 2, so he's a big movie seller. You got this action summer blockbuster. You got Tony Scott. You got a lot of egos in the room. You're not going to get along, and that's one of the most famous things about this movie is a lot of people on set did not get along at all.
Yeah.
And it kind of shows a little bit of the movie.
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is I actually think that Bruce Willis and Damon Wayans have really great on-screen chemistry.
They do.
Which is funny because they absolutely didn't get along the entirety of filming. But even the moments when they do get on, like you sense an untrustworthiness that is really strong, and I think it's actually stronger than the untrustworthiness in Lethal Weapon that ultimately leads to those two becoming partners. This film is interesting in that that meshing of the two characters, I think, would have really made an interesting franchise if this first movie was successful enough.
I had a better title. Okay, if you did, at the beginning of the movie, you have what is an homage to a lot of football from the early 90s. So, like, Hank Williams Jr. usually sang the intro, but instead they get Bill Medley, one of the Righteous Brothers, and he tries his best to amp up what's...
I think it's a cool opening, though, because they got the credits running over that Friday Night Football. And even just like, the showcase of that first game, and you get Billy Blanks in a really early career. If you guys did Tybo, Billy Blanks shows up as our main football player of the first...
He's having a psychotic break while he's playing football. But I want to mention, there was a famous professional football coach who coached the Houston Oilers, I think the Saints. His name was Bum Phillips, and he always wore a big cowboy hat. He was staunch. He was like 6'3", big gut, and they used that caricature as for the football coach.
Okay, for Sheldon or Shelley.
Shelley, which is very much a bump. Look like if you look up Bum Phil, it's like, oh yeah, that's the guy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So there's a lot of things that were happening in the 90s that they sucked out into this movie that now looks, oh yeah, that's what it looked like back then.
Yeah, and it has kind of a kinship with the Will Smith film Concussion from I think 2015 or so, and that both the films do try to tackle a little bit of like the issues with the NFL and with, concussions, with pain that comes with actually being in a professional sport. And people can always say like, you make tons of money, you should be all right with it, but we're talking about people's like livelihoods being about destroying their bodies. It's a choice that they make, but it's also one of the things that can be a hindrance, and that's what we get with Jimmy Dix, played by Damon Wayans, is that he's dealing with problems that came from his former life, and really like finds out that he's embroiled in a really dangerous career, not just for the football and the concussions.
And it's another underlying, it's not really hit over the head with it, but in the early 90s, there were not a lot of black quarterbacks, and there was a lot of pressure to be a successful black quarterback. Mm-hmm. And if you even did a little slip up, it was considered, oh, you're a failure, get away. So they're playing that a little bit without saying it out loud. That he lost his job, even though he was, being a black quarterback. Mm-hmm. He was still able to do stuff. But since there's a lot of pressure and there was a lot of discrimination in the early 90s for being a black quarterback, that he gets dumped, even though he could probably still play.
Yeah, and we get this great sequence. I think Damon Wayans does some pretty solid performing in that scene where he's discovered to be addicted to a drug, and how he responds to it by going through the steps of like how everything has to be perfect.
Yes.
And we've seen that before in other films where, especially a black character knows that there's nothing, if I do everything right, one small thing will go wrong that will lead me to be out, and I have to be perfect or I'm nothing. And I think it's a really well done scene. In fact, I do think the two characters are interesting, more so than a lot of these other kind of buddy cop films, because they do come from completely different backgrounds and they have different ways of getting into the film together. It's a really cool pairing of two performers. I just think when it comes down to it, Bruce Willis was mad because when he signed onto this film and read the script, he said it's a movie about saving my wife and my marriage. And he's like, I just did two of those in Die Hard and Die Hard 2. And it's like, you signed on to this movie. You knew what you were getting into.
It
is similar, I guess, but really like, you're a cop. There's always that, necessity of like saving the close people to you.
I was mentioned, so Tony Scott got his success with Beverly Hills Cop Part 2, Days of Thunder, and Top Gun, both with Tom Cruise, but he also maintained the same cinematographer, which was Ward Russell. Ward Russell was the cinematographer movie we already talked about, Dreamscape.
Oh, there you go.
There you go. So before him and Tony worked a lot, I think they did a lot more movies together after this one too. Another mention is Bruce McGill is in this movie, and he was in another movie we talked about already, The Lookout. So there's a lot of overplaying. We've done enough movies where they're getting a lot of the stuff we talked about before is getting blurred. We're crossing over.
Definitely, yeah.
This was the year before In Living Color started. That was a big TV show in the early 90s. It was sketch comedy, which was black comedy, which is the title, In Living Color. But it was a raw, unfiltered black comedy, which is contrast to what we got with the Bill Cosby show.
Yeah, that's true.
And it was on prime time. It was like Thursday night television, on regular television, which a lot of like, you can't say that.
Yeah.
And a lot of Damon Wayans brought that onto this film, right? That attitude that, and he's pretty much doing the same thing he did in the TV show, Living Loud.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and Living Loud is one of the things that actually got him in trouble, I believe, when he was a cast member on SNL. I think he only made like 12 episodes, and then he tanked a sketch and got fired.
Yeah.
So really,
kind of like being a quarterback in the NFL.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think, he's actually pretty well cast for the film. I buy into his former football stardom. I bought into the chemistry between him and Halle Berry in a very early role. But they also, again, they tend to paint him in an unsavory light. And it's interesting that for a man who was out of a relationship and was writing angry that Shane Black wrote Jimmy Dix as a serial cheater. And that's interesting to me. I don't know if that's really the best way you
Well, I remember that Shane wrote this from a breakup, so he's really that angle of being angry at relationships, especially with women. and how they're cheating on,
You can see that in Bruce Willis's arc. In that there's the cheating going on, and I'm not going to speak to what was going on in his relationship with Shane Black, but like you can see that Bruce Willis is angry and bitter about the way that his relationship is going. I bought that, but it was interesting to me to see Jimmy Dix. We want to buy into his relationship with Corey, yet they open up with him at the beginning of the film saying he's a serial cheater. He keeps making this mistake, and it's like I don't know if I'd sell that as being my other lead.
But they're both, for some reason, against female abuse. You catch the first two instances with Bruce Willis was his previous job, stopping the Senate or whatever he's doing, then Jimmy Dix throwing the football, making sure the guy stopped abusing the woman in the pool.
Which, thank goodness, he's a good thrower, because like she's right there next to him. Like he admits.
One thing Tony Scott likes to do and likes to work with, and I think Ward Russell also likes to work with, is a lot of putting gels on cameras. And there's a lot of gels in this movie. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of fun playing with lighting. And this is like, I didn't catch this as when you're 14, you just like action movies. But there's a lot of even like cameras on, like lighting on the floor coming up, and they're putting the gels. So there's a lot of playing with light that I really enjoy. This looks not really clean, but it looks full. It looks like a spectrum of color.
Yeah, everywhere. And that's something that, like you said with Tony Scott, he does have a sensibility to him. Throughout his entire career, he made some of these movies that kind of had a forced griminess to them.
Yeah.
I think about movies like, especially his Denzel Washington movies from like the mid-2000s, like Man on Fire, Deja Vu, Taking of Pelham, Unstoppable. Like all these ones he did with Washington in the 2000s felt like they had that same kind of like uncleanness to them, where they didn't really look pretty. And it's kind of something that pervaded his entire directing career in one way or another. Outside of some of the early stuff, like the Top Guns, the Beverly Hills Cops, he didn't really get to it too much in there. But it's something that's very obviously Tony Scott. Yeah. Whereas I think Ridley Scott had a bit of a wider berth in the things he dealt with. Tony Scott really liked what he was dealing with here. And I think it aids this film. Doesn't always aid every film, but it does aid this one.
And of course, Shane Black likes to write about wrecking cars. Mm-hmm. So, and Tony Scott loves to film wrecking cars. It's almost perfect.
I mean, Shane Black used a vehicle as a plot point in Lethal Weapon 2. It constantly comes up, don't destroy my wife's car. So, like,
or the beginning of Nice Guys, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's the best thing about Nice Guys. You watch the beginning of that's Shane Black.
Yeah, exactly. And we get a few Shane Black, very small, very undiscussed almost, Christmas references in the film. It's very, very rare. It's mentioned in passing a few times, but it's almost like you can see a little bit of that Shane Black twinkle to the screenplay there. But I do agree that I think Shane Black is kind of like Tarantino as a writer, where certain directors can handle their work better than others. I think this is a case where Shane Black works best with a Richard Donner or with himself. Whereas I think kind of like Tarantino actually worked pretty well with Tony Scott on True Romance. I actually thought they had a pretty good relationship. Movie came out pretty solid. In fact, one of the characters from True Romance, the coke dealing producer, is based on Joel Silver. So I forgot. I think it's something where like certain directors understand certain writers and understand what they're doing. And I think Shane Black was at his best with on the Lethal Weapon films, but then also working by himself because he gets it. He's got a very unique sensibility as a screenwriter. I don't know if Tony Scott perfectly gets what Shane Black is writing.
Right, because what Shane understands is when a scene, it's not so much a masking like, oh, this scene's boring, we need to have an explosion, but it's a necessity. It's a point. We talked in a previous episode where a lot of subplots don't go anywhere, but here in Last Boy Scout, you have this friction dialogue and a guy and he gets a car and blows up. And that's a good way to end your scene. We know it's ending, but it's a point that is very relevant to the story.
Yeah, and that's the thing that Shane Black tends to have a lot of scenes that don't mean much on their own, but seen within the larger narrative. If they come together the right way, they can create a really like captivating mystery in it and kind of an adventure within the action film. It's done to great effect in The Nice Guys and Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. Really done well. I'm a big defender of Iron Man 3. He has the ability to tie things in really well. Last Boy Scout's biggest missed opportunity, of course, with that like second half of the film being rewritten and reworked, is that a lot of these things don't come together the right way. Things happen to characters, and when the film ends, you can kind of place where they're supposed to be. Like when Bruce Willis's character gets kidnapped by these thugs that take him out to the wilderness, and you're like, for the entire time you're out there, you actually could be watching that scene and going, what's happening right now? Like, what did he do to trigger these people?
Yes.
You know, and it just feels like it doesn't come together and coalesce the way it should.
Well, let's bring it up because it's a good point. All of a sudden, beginning of Act 2, he has a daughter. Like, out of nowhere. Yeah.
I think that's where the rewriting away from the wife came into play, was he didn't want to be dealing. Because it sounds like his wife was going to have more of the daughter stuff to do in the second half of the film.
Yeah.
Danielle Harris, who I'm a huge fan of, from the Halloween sequels. She was in Halloween 4 and 5. She was in the remakes with Rob Zombie. She was in both of those. Big horror, like, behind-the-scenes kind of stuff with her. She appears in the film as the daughter. And again, like...
She has a mouth on her.
She's got a mouth on her. I love that she does, but that scene where they introduce her makes her a completely unlikable character, and not even, like, in the fun way that, like, the Nice Guys had a daughter character introduced.
Right.
This film really places her in a very unlikable light. She only becomes likable when she teams up with Damon Wayans.
Right, so she has different beats. Like, in the beginning, it's almost like she's 13.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of the same age I was when I saw this movie. And she has a mouth on her. She wants to go, she wants to be a teenager, and she hates her dad and everything. But then it changes.
Yeah.
But I understand the change needs to be, because when she comes in, interrupts the scene, she doesn't have the mouth on her anymore. She's almost like, but she's playing it on.
Yeah, it's that scene itself that really, I dislike that scene, because I don't think Harris is invested in that scene. I don't feel it from her as an actress, and she's a very young actress, and this was kind of her getting back into it, because she very publicly had a stalker after her Halloween films. And as a child actress,
that's right,
trying to
she
jump
did,
back into
right,
that.
Yeah.
Like, I don't feel that scene with her. I feel like she's just yelling swear words to yell swear words, and there's no, like, emotional beat to the character when she comes in and starts teaming up with Wayans, and the whole, like, second half of the film, which very dangerous stuff to include a child in.
Yeah.
It works better. It works much better.
I think her and Damon Wayans work better than Bruce and her work.
Yeah, and that great scene where she comes in to a very dangerous situation with her stuffed animal makes a lot of things work and really, like, tap out in that kind of a part. It's just that one scene where she's introduced where I'm like, why do we like her?
Why do we have to? Yeah, but kids swearing is fun.
It is, but I just don't think she's invested in it.
And like I said, she has changes of beats, which I appreciate. Yeah. I always talk about when you're writing to do exaggerations and really go way beyond expected. So yes, Shane's not afraid to exaggerate.
No.
Especially with the football, even it's supposed to be normal football, but he amps up the exaggeration. Football player having a gun that's or somebody riding a horse on the football field, and you're like, this is what's going on. But it's part of the style. I love that. I love that about this movie. It goes way over ridiculous.
It's not afraid to be a memorably odd action film.
Right.
They put you in situations that don't really like gel normally, like under any other circumstances, but he writes himself into a situation that's very odd and strange. It's kind of like, again, like the forest scene where Bruce Willis has been taken captive by these guys.
Yeah,
we don't really know who they are.
Kill Bruce!
And it's just the weirdest thing where, like, they're invested in a place, but you convince me that they're not going to kill him at that exact moment, enough time for him to maybe escape.
Yeah. Or there's a dialogue that's not really, it's fun. It's like even the cop, this smells like crap, it's the report, you guys, and that's a very staple of Shane Black.
Yeah, and that's why I think I have a gripe a little bit with Bruce Willis, because Bruce Willis almost seems, after the Die Hard films, like he's too cool to be Joe. Because he does tend to have those one-liners a little bit on the nose. He feels like he's trying to be James Bond with those one-liners, whereas I look at the things like, again, I'm going to go back to one of my favorite films, which is Lethal Weapon, where, Danny Glover's character says, like, have you ever met somebody that you didn't kill? And he's like, well, I haven't killed you yet. And it's like, I bought that line reading from Mel Gibson more than I bought a lot of...
Well, there was a certain vulnerability with Mel Gibson.
Bruce Willis is starting to get to that spot after Die Hard 2 where he thinks he's better than everyone else. And
there's no vulnerability. Like, he's just going to get out of every situation.
Yeah, he's at his best when he is a vulnerable actor, and it's just, that's why he kind of doesn't do those movies anymore where he's seen as vulnerable, and it's unfortunate, because even like Pulp Fiction, he is consistently beaten down in his role in Pulp Fiction, and he consistently has to rise above. He's never too cool for school. the first Die Hard movie is never too cool for school. But you look at some of these other movies that have come out, like most notably his interactions with Kevin Smith on Cop Out, where he's cooler than everyone else in the room, and it makes him a little bit too smug, you know. And even like the Die Hard sequels, again, like we don't like him because he's not the everyman anymore.
Right. Yeah. So overall, I still enjoy this movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's Shane Black. It's ridiculous fun. You know, it's a little bit of that what we call empty escapism that bled from the '80s, but I don't like the title.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't know what to think about the movie's title when we went to see. In fact, when we talked about doing this one, you had said like we confused the titles for Last Action Hero and Last Boy Scout because they were just kind of like, you know, interchangeable almost. Yeah. Last Boy Scout for me, I think if you're a fan of Shane Black's work, it's not a tough movie to find and get accessible with. I think if you didn't like his other films, like if you didn't like The Nice Guys, if you don't like Lethal Weapon, which, how dare you? If you don't like those movies, I don't think this is going to sway you in one direction or the other. Right. That's kind of the thing, is it's a Shane Black movie at its least Shane Black, and it's got kind of those sensibilities where if you just don't like those other movies, I'm not going to tell you to watch this. But I would recommend the film for anybody who's a fan of other Shane Black written screenplays, because it does have that style, that finesse. It's just not as maybe clear cut as his other work.
No, it's not polished, but he doesn't want to have it polished. Yep. Have you seen The Last Boy Scout?
Yes. Let us know. Comment down below with your thoughts on it. Yeah. This is, again, like, remember way back when I was a younger person, this was recommended to me by a guy I worked at the gas station with. And he was like, "Here, I'll borrow you my copy of this movie." And he just adored it and stuff. And it's kind of that underground, you know, you hear it from us and haven't. So if you haven't seen the movie, now you've heard to go check it out. Pause us, come back, and tell us what you thought about it. Don't forget to like the video, too. It's really helpful to us in the YouTube algorithm. And you can subscribe and get our content every time it drops. We have 2 episodes every week coming at you, so you might as well be subscribed so you can get all that stuff. You can also support us in a different way by checking out the Patreon.
Patreon!
We got the link down in the description right there, patreon.com/KyleNick on Film. And that way you can kind of support independent content creators and also get a chance to be a part of the conversation with the different films and things we talk about.
Yeah, so become a member, join the Patreon. This is the last movie of 1991. We're moving on.
Yep, we're moving on to a different theme next week. Just give a hint, expect some rubble to fall down upon you. So we're coming at you next week with our new theme. But first, this is the end of our episode. You can find my film reviews on GoFilmReviews.com.
You can find the St. Paul Filmcast everywhere you listen or find podcasts.